Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is James Hansen. I'm the Vice President and Publisher of NextGov, the Federal Technology News Division of Government Executive Media Group. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, The Future of Data Management Equals the Death of Data Silos, hosted by Information Builders, Inc. With augmented analytics and AI-driven cloud reservoirs, the future of data management may seem unclear. Agencies are investing millions in data infrastructure and data scientists, focusing on starting to shift to task automation, secure information sharing, future-proofing government systems. And I'm excited today to really have an in-depth conversation with some true thought leaders in the space around cutting edge data methodologies and look to prepare government agencies for the future of data management. And with that, I'd like to welcome Richard Allen, the Chief Data Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency, Lieutenant Colonel Ron Sinikowski, the Director of Data Capabilities with the Air Force, and Deep Upal, the Vice President of Innovation and Technology for Public Sector at IBI. For you in the audience, I'd like to point out the Q&A tab to the right. That will allow you to ask questions. Feel free to submit those throughout the program. You don't have to raise your hand. Keep sending them in, and we'll get to them as we go along. With that, to start things off, I'd like to turn it over to Deep to tell us a little bit about himself and the value of data management today. Deep? I think you're still on mute there, sir.
All right. Sorry about that. Little technical difficulties. Hopefully it's not going to be indicative of how today's going to go, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much, James. I appreciate it. My name is Deepinder Upal. As you indicated, I am the Vice President for Innovation and Technology for the Public Sector for Information Builders. So my role here at Information Builders speaks a lot to data management, speaks a lot to a lot of upcoming concepts that we talk about when we talk about technology, when we talk about AI, when we talk about ML, we talk about all of those concepts of data that we can incorporate and move forward with when it comes to data sharing. A lot of the work that I do has a lot of integration points with a lot of federal agencies, a lot of DoD agencies, in the hopes of integrating a lot of this future technologies within their ecosystem. Prior to my role here at Information Builders, I was the Assistant Division Director for the Criminal Justice Information Center. And prior to that, I was an academic for almost a decade, taught in systems logic, advanced logic, probability theory. And then prior to that, I was in the United States military, served in the capacity of the Signals Intelligence, Signal Corps. But what I thought I'd do today is just really quickly kind of get over everything. I just wanted to kind of set the stage in the sense of what do we mean by the death of data silos? What do we mean when we talk about the concept of data management? And then after that, I thought we could kind of turn it over to the moderation session. I do want a lot of emphasis on that. We have some amazing panelists here today, so it's going to be really amazing to hear what they have to say. I guess the main concept that I'd like to put out is we've seen in 2020, almost from 2019 to 2020, an update in almost every federal or DoD data strategy. Heck, the Air Force just recently released theirs in an update and addendum in November. And what we see from there is a movement to break down these data silos and incorporate a huge amount of data in larger platforms so people can leverage that, so people can make use of that, and kind of give to the promise that exists when we talk about advanced technologies such as AI or ML. Now, when we go through these data strategies, what we often see are some common elements, and those are just some of the common elements that I'd like to call out. And the reason why is because during the moderation session, during the conversation, during the discussion, these are points that you'll see come up time and time and again, so they're super relevant. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a movement for all of these DoD/federal agencies to look for platforms that are source agnostic in the sense of natively being able to connect out into whatever data source exists, whether it's a traditional relational database, whether we're talking about any type of graph database, time series database, or even some of the more tactical or more esoteric formats, whether we're talking about citizen science on the federal level or whether we're talking about Link 16 on more of the DoD. Also, these platforms are looking to be destination agnostic, and though they're looking for analytics, advanced analytics, mapping, and a huge amount of other emphasis placed on BI, often a lot of that data is going to be forwarded off into a system that already exists. So those systems have to be agnostic when it comes to destination. Obviously, when we start talking about the breakdown of data silos and we talk about the idea of data sharing, one of the main things that often comes out is the concept that all of these data strategies underline cyber compliance, security compliance, whether that comes from a FedRAMP architecture or you're talking about the idea of being able to share information, whether you're on NIPR, whether you're on SIPR, whether you're in the classified space, whether you're on unclassified, or you're taking data that's coming in from any type of public IP. And then, of course, finally, I'd like to say you have to be interoperable, elastic, and extensible. And what do I mean by interoperable? I think we'll have a lot of conversations around that. And what I mean to say when we talk about interoperability is interoperability between having a core that could be located in a cloud versus already being able to process on the edge. For DoD, that could be the tactical edge. For a lot of federal civilian agencies, that just might be edge compliance, such as monitoring stations. And being able to pass data back and forth in between and operate potentially even on the disconnected state. Those are often common points that we've seen no matter what data strategy we've taken a look at. And through that, what we've seen is a huge amount of different use cases that are established. Well, I'm not going to waste any more time when it comes to a bunch of slides. What I do want to do is I want to stop sharing this, and I want to immediately get into the moderation session. I'll turn it back over to you, James.
Awesome. Thanks, Deep, for that quick intro. I think it is important to understand the commonalities between the different federal data strategies, whether that be the federal one or the recently released defense data strategy, because there are some standards that kind of make the use of data easier between systems and address some of the things that you mentioned. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Richard and Lieutenant Colonel Sinikowski. Sorry, Colonel. Before we start, let's just do a quick intro to describe your organization's mission and your role and responsibility in it, largely as it relates to the management of data. Richard, do you want to go first?
Surely. So I work for the Environmental Protection Agency. Obviously, our core mission is to protect human health and the environment. We're largely a regulatory agency. I have been in the role of CDO for a little, I guess, right on a year now. So I started acting as a CDO early last fall, and I've been here about a year. A lot of what I have been doing so far is really building a people coalition. So, I know a lot of this is about technology. My focus has largely been around building a coalition of people who are data field agents, if you will. They're our data heroes, and I need their buy-in and their help to really help us, get an, sort of a cradle to grave data management and governance strategy and procedures and all that good stuff built.
Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Colonel?
Absolutely. So my name is Ron Sinikowski. I'm our Director of Data Capabilities in the Air Force's Chief Data Office. Our office at large really is chartered on the mission of making data visible and accessible to the department as a whole. You'll notice the acronym VALTIS is often used in a lot of the strategies, that visible and accessible being the first piece of that. And we'll go into some of the others, I'm sure, as the discussion goes on. My directorate in particular, responsible for two different areas, oversight of our use cases, which often are either catalysts for showing people the art of the possible, or building out specific enterprise capabilities and putting tools into the hands of the users to be able to do advanced analytics on that data, or to set them up for success in an AI or ML type effort. And then the second division of the directorate does our budgeting and congressional engagement, specifically, holistic discussions around data and data investments in the Air Force's budgeting process, and our communication with Congress around data.
Excellent. Thank you for that intro, Lieutenant Colonel and Richard. Lieutenant Colonel, let's stick with you. And as the Air Force is going through, just like the DoD is through their digital modernization strategy, as you guys are looking at digital transformation, what impacts does that have on your data management approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just recently completed a review of where the Air Force is making our investments within data. And, a couple of things that have come out of that. One is, in a lot of cases, we have talent in the Air Force. We have folks that are smart on data, and we have a lot of ongoing efforts. Additionally, it's very clear that our senior leadership, at the 3-star and 4-star level, recognize the value of data and what it can bring in terms of, decision advantage, and having that data dominance that allows you to respond quickly and, stay within the OODA loop of the decision cycle, if you will. And but the part that we're having discussions on is being purposeful, specifically in those investments, so that we're aligning those to our missions within the Air Force. So we obviously have a lot of mission space that we cover, and as we are what we're finding is that we're, in a lot of cases, cleaning up the same data multiple times in in different functional areas. And so there's a lot of goodness being done in different data models and stuff that are being built. But what we want to do is raise that up to the enterprise level, where we can have share that benefit across the entire enterprise. So the data can be used cross-functionally in a way that will enable us to do what-if scenarios in ways that on the business side, for example, that we haven't been able to do in the past, and certainly on the operational side, to be able to have data flow to where it needs to. And so that starts to speak into the data standards and stuff that you were mentioning. But in any case, so that's where our focus is right now, in aligning the purpose of our investments to those missions, and making sure that we're taking full advantage of every dollar that we spend.
So I just wanted to, I guess, mirror some of that. So my partner in crime is our relatively newly minted chief architect, IT architect. And he predates me in my role for about a year. Prior to coming to this role, I was leading a data visualization effort across the agency, and we built up a couple of sort of common commercial BI tools. And now they're some of the most widely used software components at our agency. And so I'm telling you this not to highlight my past, but that created another data challenge for us. So we have many, many systems, and the architect is working on a digital strategy to try to sort of rationalize which IT solutions we are using for analytics and visualization and data management, et cetera. Because we have so many solutions, we're duplicating data, and as Lieutenant Colonel mentioned, we're cleaning it up multiple times. We create versioning problems for ourselves. And so we're looking to reduce some of that burden upon ourselves by figuring out what IT components we need, which is largely going to be driven by what IT components people in our enterprise are using most and most effectively. So we had as part of our IT portfolio review led by the Chief Information Officer, who we both report to, we co-opted a portion of that to ask all of our programs and regions, so we have 10 regions and 12 programs, what their data challenges were, what tools they knew existed. And these were hour to 2 hour long interviews with sort of some of their core leadership on data and some of their, hands deep, arms deep folks who are deeply involved in managing or using or analyzing or visualizing or communicating their data. And from that, we have this long list of things, but you can sort of identify it, and we're trying to build this into our digital strategy. There's a couple of common themes. One is we don't communicate as well as we could internally. So our people don't necessarily know where the data that they want are. They don't even know that it exists necessarily, and even if they do, finding it can be a challenge. And then there's a goal, a challenge for us in terms of providing the proper guidance. So if there's a lack of overall guidance from us, people create their own governance strategies and create their own management. And we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We're working with them to figure out what their best strategies are and how to integrate them a little more holistically across our agency.
That's great, Richard. So, Deep, I'm going to turn to you because, the title of today's topic is, the death of data silos, and it sounds like that's exactly what the Lieutenant Colonel and Richard are dealing with and trying to solve against. Can you talk a little bit about, as you're working with different agencies across spectrums and verticals and missions, like how do you help them as they are going through this continuous transformation to do exactly that, kind of, break down the silo and ensure that data is being used and isn't being
No, I think, both Rich as well as, Colonel Sinikowski, they've kind of said it really well. I think they're doing everything right when it comes to the idea of setting down a foundation. Now, generally, whenever we start to work with a federal agency or DoD, it's almost as if every single time we're coming across like a tripod, so to speak. The first concept would be inventory or cataloging. Like, what do we actually have in terms of data sources? And there you see a lot what Lieutenant Colonel Sinikowski was talking about, like a lot of duplication that's happening. And you see, okay, are we using this data source multiple times? Are people bringing it in multiple times? Are people leveraging different methodologies to bring it in? Because all of that's really dangerous, right? That's how you get two versions of the truth. That's how you get a lot of resources spent on the same data source. So inventorying your environment, inventorying the assets that you have available alongside what data products are being created is almost essential. The second part of that tripod that I often see is the concept of data governance. Now, data governance is going to speak to a lot of what Rich is going to kind of talk about a little bit later today, but also a little bit about what he just said, in the sense of this data that's coming in, who owns it, what classification level, what security level, but more importantly, what is the quality of that data that's coming in? Is there a lot of errors in there? Is it even usable in its current state? And what can be done in order to enhance that data? Now, often when we talk about the idea of working with any type of DoD or federal organization, the concept of breaking down silos, what is the hardest part of that? I'm often asked that no matter where I go to give a presentation, and it's not the technology and it's not the inventory, it's not the governance principles, it's not the data strategy that looks super nice on paper. It's often just the concept of a cultural change. So how does that impact? That cultural change is directly connected to people being invested in the data that they're taking care of. So what you see a lot in DoD and in the federal space is a lot of people have this ownership of data and this ownership of the databases that they run, that they maintain, and rightfully so. But this ownership has almost evolved into like a anthropomorphic relationship that they have with this data. So therefore, they need to be included. It's important for them to be included. And a lot of that second tripod, that governance concept, allows them to be included. If the data is not doing well, if there's a methodology in play to include it and fix it, you can provide that back to the primary data source owner. And they start to see a value in what you're doing. And to extend upon that concept of value to the third tripod, what we're really talking about there is use case driven ideas, use case driven analytics, not using technology just for technology's sake in the sense of technology wagging the dog. Let's make sure that we have use cases to support what we're trying to do. And once again, once you have use cases front and forward, what you start to have is a huge amount of goodwill, because now people start to see the value of what you're doing. And remember, so many data initiatives fail simply for the fact that the end user doesn't really understand what's being done, or more importantly, doesn't understand the value of what's being done. So by having a use case driven methodology into what you're creating, into what you're doing, allows for you to pull them into it so they feel invested and they truly understand how their workflow, how their process, how what they do day in and day out is going to be improved.
Yeah, let's stick on that use case because the lieutenant colonel said that's one of the core missions of his office, and there was a ton of the really good ones, Deep, that you had on that second slide around certainly predictive maintenance as one that's been high priority for the DoD. Lieutenant Colonel, you want to talk about some of the use cases that you guys are looking at in terms of like how we use that data, and then how does somebody attach ownership to that use case?
Yeah, the condition-based maintenance or predictive maintenance is definitely an area that we are investing funds and making a lot of progress in regards specifically to our aircraft. But the one that I think I'd like to highlight here is an emerging one that our budgeting and capability planning community is getting around. It's specific. It goes by the name of Guardian right now, but our leadership is looking at the algorithms that are being developed specifically around that, in order to get at how we're what if scenarios around our flying hour program, around our weapon system sustainment, in making more informed decisions and where we're spending our money and what kind of capabilities, doing what if scenarios on that. And the reason I want to highlight that one in particular is because in that effort, we're bringing together about 50 different data sources and standing up, persistent data connections, to those sources so that, these can be refreshed real time with no, manual export and import of the data and things. And, our senior leaders recognize the value of where they want to go in terms of these timely decisions and being able to run a lot of scenarios. But to a lot of Deep's points about, the cultural ownership a lot of times within the department of that data, right now, and this is changing, but even within the Air Force, there's still this idea of even within the Air Force, there's still this idea of doing memorandums of agreement, that are 15, 20 pages long on how the data is going to be used and for what purposes. And, and this is between Air Force organizations all internally, right? And there's reasons behind it. I mean, people, units from one function use data from another, and some decisions are made on it. And long story short, program timelines are impacted and operational capabilities impacted. And so there's valid reasons behind that, and there's steps we can take to address that. But to give some specifics to this, if depending on where you are in the Air Force, a couple of years ago when you went to move out on an effort like this, there are some efforts that 9 months, even over a year and a half to set up these different persistent data connections was kind of like the starting point, right? And it's just a whole lot of back and forth. And as we've elevated that up to the to our general officer level, and we moved out on some exec exhorts from our chief and stuff, saying, hey, these are the efforts we're focusing on, and we will pull in data. And we've collapsed that timeline down in some cases to a matter of weeks, right? Where it's a whole lot easier when you have a really strong champion that says we're going to do this effort, and this is why we're doing it, and and they're at the right level, and to be able to do that. And there's still work involved in that, but to your point and Deep's point, when you have that, you're helping a mission owner move out on a particular capability, and in this case, our budgeting and resourcing community, they get into the fight with you, and they are like, what do you need? How can I realize the magnitude of the work here, not only from a technology perspective, but bringing in those data sources, and then doing all the work in terms of linking them together in a way that's valid, that is verified by the functional community that you're looking at the data correctly, right? And that you're using it in a way that is will be ultimately signed off and accountable in the end. And so but they join you in that fight, and they're willing to help out, they're willing to participate, and help the department overall we get to where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's great work there. I mean, shortening that data chain is and decision-making chain is one of the primary outcomes of where government needs to be going in terms of the use of data. Rich, can you talk a little bit about some of the use cases that you guys are looking at in terms of how you're applying data?
So some of the, I'm going to broaden the scope here a little bit. So we do, as I'm sure we all do, interagency projects as well, and that I've found forces a little higher level visibility, moves up through the food chain a little bit better. We're engaged with trying to think of the agency, I guess customs. So we're working with customs, taking shipping manifests and customs reports from where ships enter port, as well as pesticide registrations, combining those with a few other data sets, all being done in the cloud. And it's forcing us to manage those data in a much more holistic manner so that they're interoperable with some other data that are pretty disparate from our normal purposes. And the notion there is to find the needle in the stack of needles, data mine and look for where incoming pesticide shipments are not properly labeled, where there's some challenges with moving controlled chemicals across borders. So that's like a data mining effort. And I just wanted to make this point too. There's two kinds of data mining. There's data mining where you're really looking for things deep in your data, by applying other data. And then there's data mining, my data, not yours. And we have to break down that latter one, which we've all talked about, right? It's like, it's not your data, it's our data. And as soon as people realize that we're all better off if we can share those data, and it is, we need to manage it in such a way that it is interoperable with other data assets, we can all see a great benefit. We engage with, more recently with the census on one of their programs called the Opportunity Project. And that's a collaboration with private entities and universities where you get external expertise in building data visualizations, largely data, formally a little more based on analytics, but they're all visual cloud-based or web-based platforms so that the public can interact with combined federal data assets to address, societal problems. Air quality was a big issue for this time around. So several of our air folks lent their expertise to work with, the likes of Esri and IBM and Georgetown University and some other universities to build these products. And they're not quite done yet, but But I have certainly found that there's lots of collaborative projects going around. We actually have a pretty rich data science community, and they share data very effectively. It's a matter of getting it out of the closet sometime, but internally it pays dividends. But when you get these external projects collaboratively with other agencies, you really can drive to the administrator level and demonstrate the mission potential of all these things, which then leads to better resourcing. EPA is certainly not the wealthiest of agencies, so we're always struggling with resourcing things like data management. It's slightly off topic here, but we're trying to figure out exactly how much time and money we spend on data management, which is tricky because anybody who's doing an analysis spends a bunch of their time organizing the data, smoothing it out. And sometimes estimated as much as 80% of the analytical process is spent on getting your data ready for those analyses. So how much time do we spend on data management? That way we can level set. Are we really, we talk about data being our most important asset. Well, then we should be putting our resources where our mouth is. And are we? It's tricky. We're working on it. Hopefully, we've had this time next year, I'll have a better idea of sort of what level of magnitude we're spending in terms of data management.
In Rich's, the programs that Rich, I just like to point out, the programs that he's talking about, like the FIFRA, I think is what you're talking about for Customs and Border Patrol and pesticides as they're coming in. I mean, that's, especially during COVID, that's an entire supply chain and food chain issue that definitely has a huge impact. But my favorite example that you provided was the American Children's and the environment, the working with the census group, because that's really taking a look at the broader United States and being able to take all of that environmental data and start to apply that out with census use cases. And by virtue of that, really shows the true power and potential of how data can not only improve a single group, but obviously how can it improve the United States citizens? How can it help us enhance our everyday efforts and our children and so on and so forth? So that's an amazing program.
So Deep, I want to stick with you for a second. And I know we're kind of jumping around here, but I think it's
cool. It's cool.
Great conversation. We heard in the beginning, the challenges that the lieutenant colonel faced at the Air Force and Rich faces at EPA. I'm sure there are lots of people in our audience that are facing kind of the same things, but there are use cases where it's been done successfully. Some of the things that, in terms of managing the data, breaking down these silos. So I kind of have a two-part question for you. The first is, where's that yin and yang kind of moment for certain agencies that you're working with and have experience with? Like, is it just starting with really small use cases and then, ultimately we have to figure out a way? I mean, in order for government to get over some of these challenges, we have to figure out how to scale it. And we'll get to that question. But I just wanted, from your perspective and all the experience that you have, like, is there a yin and yang moment where it's like, oh, we can actually connect these systems, we can make them inoperable, we have the right data, and then is there maybe a use case where whether it's interagency or intra-agency, where it's kind of, everything kind of clicked together? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, no, it totally does. So like, let me just take your questions one at a time. I think the first question, that whole yin and yang, executing on a use case and how do you go about doing it? How do you balance it against all of the other tripod that I was talking about? I think, whenever you talk about the world of data or data science, like people throw out statistics when it comes to any type of data project, specifically any type of governance or master data management project. And often the statistic is something close to like 85% of any master data management program is going to end in a way where people are going to feel disappointed or a loss of expectation in some way, shape, or form. And part and parcel of that is because they don't see the value of it before it's finished. So they never give it the opportunity to finish, and they never are able to realize the benefits. So what it's really important to do is, as you start to go through your process of providing resolution to use cases, people need to see, the end user needs to see what is the value of this. So what does that mean in simple English? And then we can go to your second part, because that's kind of what it transitions to. What that means in simple English is, you may have a huge amount of data sources out there that you have to catalog, you have to organize, you have to master, you have to cleanse. But maybe it's important to have a second stream of work where you're taking what you've already done and showcasing the value of it to the end user. So whether you're talking about any of the work that the Vault, for instance, is doing in the United States Air Force, or any of that work that the Customs and Border Patrol alongside the EPA is in the process of doing, and showing those end users exactly a benefit as you continue to scale, as you continue to cleanse, as you continue to grow across your environment, I think that's hugely impactful and very, very important. Now, prior to, and then this is the second part to your question. So prior to the start of this this webinar, this webcast, me and the Lieutenant Colonel, we were having a discussion just about, there's a lot of remote work going on, and I asked him if members of the United States Air Forces are using SecureView, or how are they accessing a lot of sensitive information when they're remote. And there's a number of different projects and a number of different programs in order to do so. But I think some of the most impactful and eventful things that we've been a part of is allowing people in a lot of these remote areas, especially in this day and age, whether you're talking about tactical edge networking, or you're talking about people who are really remote and have to rely on edge devices, to connect all the way back into their core and leverage that data while the process, that larger vision of data governance, is coming into fruition. So therefore, even the people who are the furthest out there don't feel disenfranchised. In fact, they feel as if they're a part of this larger product, this larger concept of data cleansing, of data mastering, and of course, advanced analytics.
I think that's very, very helpful. So it's kind of small pivot, but not really. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the challenges or roadblocks that are moving from data collection to that data insights and outcomes. And Lieutenant Colonel, I'll start with you in terms of, the program that you mentioned might be a good example, or another one where you have your data, you actually broke down some silos, you brought it together, and then how do you transition that to actual insights that are producing outcomes like the Guardian program or use case that you were mentioning? What are some of the challenges that agencies need to overcome to get to that insight piece?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, having the technology to actually manage your data and a place to aggregate it together and apply your advanced analytics. That technology is really just the first step. The second step is getting the data, and then the third step is really how you're going to apply the ontologies to that data, so that the different objects you're building around that data in terms of what you're going to use in your analytics is really where the marrying of your data scientists and those with the skill sets in coding in Python or R or Julia meet with your SMEs from the functional communities that actually understand the mission and what you're trying to accomplish, and getting those two communities working together in a way that you can accomplish the analytic outcome you're going after. And something else, not to step back, but it's related to this discussion. There are communities in the Air Force who I would say have solved this data management challenge, right? I mean, have it down cold. And we learn a lot of, we take a lot of lessons learned from them, specifically, our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, our ISR community, our IC community, are some of the most knowledgeable and have, the right skill sets. when it comes to, data engineers and data architects and, marrying them up with data analysts. And so we pull a lot of lessons learned from that community. There's also, but even in a prior job, I had the opportunity to work, in our acquisition community, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, but in our recent reviews of some of our analytic programs and things, one of the things I realized is that back in 2012, our acquisition two-letter here at the headquarters, they brought together all acquisition data across what we call ACATs, ACAT 1, 2, and 3s. All the spending, all the contracts, all the CLINs, it all comes together. And so that, the budget analysts at headquarters can review all of that data without having to go through tons and tons of spreadsheets. And that data has been all brought together. It's been, curated, cleaned up, linked, and stuff like that. And that is ongoing, healthy, data pipeline, if you will. And so I think what we're seeing now, the transition we're experiencing, is that there's a recognition across many other communities that aren't nearly resourced at the same level that our ISR community is, or that our acquisition community is, right? And they are recognizing that, in our audits, in our finance, in our in our depots and things like that, we can apply these data scientist skill sets, these advanced analytics. And so the Deep mentioned the Vault data platform, and so that platform, among others, that's really what they're doing, is putting those types of tools into the these communities that aren't resourced quite as well, and giving them broader access to the data that might not be coming through their functional community, our small business community, our FMS community. But with that, the part that the challenge is that there isn't that same level of understanding of what goes between, okay, I've got the tools, I've got the data, and a lot of times you talk to, not all of our senior leaders by any means, but sometimes you walk into a room and somebody says, yes, let's do data. And you literally know that's like the only thing they realize is like data, right? And there's no discussion, there's no understanding of what that means, or the analytic, flow that goes from ingesting the data to doing the analytics. And so helping our decision makers and the folks in that community understand those steps so that we can resource that properly, so that we can have sustainable pipelines, whether it's the budgeting one, whether it's condition-based maintenance, or whether it's something for one of our smaller communities that's just stepping into data analytics and stuff for the first time.
No, that's great. And actually, I want to encourage the audience again. We got a couple questions that came in, so I'll get to those. I do just want to ask Richard kind of a follow on to what the Lieutenant Colonel was saying. Rich, you mentioned early on that you were building data field agents, that you were building kind of this community of people that understand, data and data science. Can you talk a little bit about how you're doing that, and kind of similar, like how do you take that data collection and glean insights? We know the technology is available. Is it doing kind of exactly what the Lieutenant Colonel was kind of outlining, and how you've been approaching that with your data field agents?
So the data field agents is an interesting evolution here. So as many of you know, CDOs were required to create a data governance body. I am well connected with the executive class at APA, but having another council of executives wasn't really going to help me get support and labor for some of the work that I need to do. So I have 0 staff, incidentally. So I'm a CDO shop of 1. I beg, borrow, and steal staff, and I matrix with some other executives to make sure that I use their staff and I can direct their staff. That said, I created the Data Governance Council of just those data field agents. So I asked some of our executives to dedicate some of their arms deep folks, senior staff involved in data to form that council. So my council is also very, very big. I have about 80 people on my data governance council. So it's more of a data mob, but they help me understand what tools they are using and how they are generating data, better data quality, how they're collecting their data. There's another story there, but basically I am leveraging their expertise and their experience to try to generate some more solid, complete enterprise level solutions and processes for EPA. In terms of sort of data collection to analysis, we're actually in the process now of going through all of our information collection requests and finding out how those data are flowing into the agency, where they're being stored, how often they are being duplicated. And sometimes, statute dictates that we must have duplicative data collections. Quality is a tricky thing, right? So quality is a multifaceted thing. One person's need for quality is different than another, depending on the analysis. Timeliness, precision, continuity. All these things matter, but they don't matter all the time. They don't matter equally. So the challenge for me there is for us to figure out how we're collecting these data, what the quality elements are of those data. So instead of saying this is the authoritative data, we might have some raw version of the authoritative data that's required by statute, but that's seldom useful to anyone. So you need to do some massaging of it initially, and then this version of the data is best fit for this purpose. So when somebody says, what is your authoritative data, or what is your best quality data? Well, what do you want to do with it? Is the real question you have to ask back to them. We've also found, antithetical to what I said earlier, that sometimes new tools drive the need for better data integration for analysis. So, some BI tools, for instance, are demanding that, say, our financial data owners are allowing for more direct access to the financial data so that we can integrate all of our administrative data for certain processes and really see the patterns and really generate some savings, both in terms of time spent analyzing data as well as real savings that we're spending money duplicatively, et cetera.
Before we I have a question for Deep, and then we'll get to the audience questions, but please keep them coming in. We got a good 12 minutes left. Deep, so we talked about how to turn data collection and data into insights, but taking a step back, what are some, listening to what Rich was talking about, what are some data collection and storage best practices in order to get to that state?
I kind of liked where Rich was leading with that. I like the concept of understanding the authoritative data source, but also understanding the use case that is going to need the type of data from that source, whether it's enhanced, whether it's augmented, whether it's raw data that's coming from there. What are we trying to do? What is the analytic being produced? And of course, what are the predictive elements that we're going to take into consideration? Now, the first concept behind all of that is to understand the authoritative data source, right? To have a good understanding of not only the data governance concept in the sense of who's the owner of the source, who's the data steward, what are the elements that make up that source, but also the sense of what is the security that's in place and who does that attribute itself to. Once we have an understanding of that, when we talk of data quality, we now have things to do. Now, when I say things to do, it just seems pretty ambiguous, so I'd like to kind of drill down into that. When I worked for government, I was the chief data steward for my agency. And as the chief data steward, I would do exactly what Rich was talking about. You come into a room and you sit down and you have data stewards from other agencies. You're trying to work on an interagency project and you're all data stewards, but what are you doing there? What is the aside from creating a data strategy, outside of developing some governance principles, what are you doing? What is it that you can do there? Well, if you're given the right tools when you're working with data governance, when you unify that methodology, you can now have tools to understand what needs to get done. So for instance, if you have a tool that can allow you to do data lineage, for instance, you can now say, hey, look, your data is coming across 5 different transformations, and as I see it, it has a high degree of error. Maybe if you change out some of those transformations and we can use a different methodology to access your data, we can now go ahead and cleanse that data before it even comes to us. Because data in the core is pure, but as it starts to move, it's like that IKEA chair. I take that IKEA chair, I go home, and I'm like drilling it together with a nail gun, and it doesn't resemble what it used to or what it needs to look like. Other concepts when you talk about governance is the ability to leverage all of your remediation tools that you have and provide those remediation tools back to data owners. Because at the end of the day, good data from the source, that authoritative source, is going to benefit whoever's sharing that data. So once again, that's really, really important to do. And then finally, I think the other concept that we really need to put into perspective, and we really haven't talked outside of tangentially about it, is cost. When you start talking about data science, when you start talking about advanced analytics, when you start talking about all of these watchwords, what I have seen is time and time and again, a lot of agencies, a lot of government organizations don't truly understand as they start to expand their ecosystem how much that's actually going to cost them. And the reason why is because, sure, you have an entire promise of the cloud. The cloud was supposed to save us so much money. It was supposed to be elastic, extensible, and to a great deal, to a great extent, it does all those things. But if you want to create an application that has a dynamic prediction that's constantly being displayed, you now have to deal with the compute. Now you have to deal with the storage of that data. Now you have to deal with all of the security apparatus that you'll have to stand up as additional infrastructure in order to establish that connection point, and what you have there equates to money. So another concept that you have to take into consideration is to say, well, what is the end use case? Is it to drive the application? Is it to drive the prediction? Then maybe I don't need to go to a traditional methodology when it comes to ETL. Maybe I don't need a database to store it. Maybe I want to do a different thing, such as abstraction or virtualization or another methodology to bring that data directly to the consumption layer. So those are just different thoughts that we've dealt with when it comes to working from governance, establishing security, going through remediation, and then making sure we're use case driven.
Yeah, well, we definitely, the security question and challenge is coming up in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to Lieutenant Colonel. One of the questions we received was, how does data management work together with classification management? That is classification marking for information security integrated with data management so that it facilitates and does that hinder data interoperability?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thanks for passing that my way. When in the Department of Defense as a whole, it's recognized that security is always a primary consideration in every transaction, every mission, and I think in fact it does often act as a moderator, right, in our ability to innovate. So taking some of what Deep just talked about in the cloud, that ability to be elastic and to share from, one cloud instance to another cloud instance, once you apply all of our security protocols, in the RMF framework and everything like that, suddenly it slows a lot of that down and you're not able to take advantage of all of that as quickly. And so, but what I would like to actually propose, to our broader audience is that this is an area that I think we're really going to see AI in particular, be a huge force multiplier as we begin to specifically around the issue of classification management. Right now, a lot of our, we have classification guides, right? And so if you're working in a classified mission set, it's dependent upon that particular individual, right, to be familiar with the classification guide and be sensitive to the data that they're passing, and any sort of markings and who it's getting passed to, and to mark it appropriately and things. And so there's no reason that can't be implemented in your data governance and your data management. So that's handled at a machine-to-machine level, where you take the human out of the loop if you codify that in your data management system and processes. So that's definitely an area that I don't want to call out specific vendors or anything in a forum like this, but on our SIPR side, we have started to move into that space to take some initial first steps for the broader Air Force. Again, I think in our, as you move into our JWICs and SAP spaces and things like that, there's some of that already is being utilized. But again, for the broader Air Force and implementation of like the Vault data platform and stuff, we're starting to step into that as well to be able to handle that more from a machine perspective, where it's removes that need for a human to go through a classification guide, and quite frankly, probably increases the accuracy and reduces the probability that there's going to be a mistake made.
We got another question, which certainly has, I think, a security bent to it. But Deep, I'm going to bring this one to you. How many access points would be acceptable for data transmission? With the caveat. Oh, you're ready? Go.
Yeah, no, I saw that question come across the chat, and I was thinking about that. I think that it really depends upon what the end use case is of the data, and of course, what data are we talking about? There's some data sources that are extremely sensitive. So, for instance, time series databases that contain multiple variables, multiple elements. For instance, spatial tracking. For instance, SATCOM transmissions that we get, they're so complex that when you talk about, transformation of that data, you have to be very, very careful of that to avoid that IKEA problem that I talked about. Other data formats are far more resilient, when you talk about relational data, or even when you talk about the movement of flat files left and right. And that's why traditionally people have even done things like that. But when we start talking about modern concepts of data and data science, and we start talking about this entire conversation that we've been having in terms of data governance, if you have an environment and you're supplying data to an individual, there's no reason why another stacked component, whether that be a tenant, whether that be another interagency cooperation task force, can't leverage that same process that you've gotten through. We want to do as much consistency as possible, and we want to unify the process and, of course, unify the tools that we have. Therefore, if agency 1 is leveraging that data source, then agency 2 leveraging that same data source, using that same process and being consistent in that methodology is going to arrive at the same conclusion. And that's how you eliminate a lot of that, hey, two versions of the truth problem, or the data is actually formed differently. I know I mentioned data virtualization a minute ago, but that's often a use case for data virtualization simply for the fact that you don't need to create application front-end logic for that. You're grabbing data, the metadata literally, directly from the source system and conveying it directly into the application layer. So sometimes you don't have to worry about, hey, am I going to mess up the data format as I make through that transmission? But a clear-cut case of how many points, how many times can I replicate this data structure is really dependent upon what you're trying to do, but also where you're trying to send it. Like, I really liked how Ron just answered a lot of that. Like, how do you transfer classified information? Like, how would you go about doing any type of classification when it comes to classified information? So once again, that you have to take into consideration as well. I mean, and to that extent, I would say that you should probably participate in a framework. And I say that because a lot of people don't understand that these frameworks exist so you don't have to replicate multiple times. So you don't have to come up with a unique way to transfer data from an unclass system to a class system. And people kind of shun frameworks sometimes, and they want to just do their own thing. but things exist for a reason. So for instance, DISA has that entire program. When you talk about the idea of classified information and movement, the enterprise commercial solutions for classified systems, to take a lot of commercially available products and to say, how do I take that data and move it up? This also has, ODIN, it also has ODNI, it has also a ton of other frameworks in place for movement of data across different domains. Now, taking that into account, you also have larger frameworks such as NIST, such as FedRAMP, which also take into account, well, when you talk about a primary data structure and you're talking about an endpoint, how many different transformations do we need to have? How is that going to be done? What are the cyber implications of what's being done? And if we follow these frameworks, they provide us good guides. And if you're selecting a vendor, if you're looking at somebody to do some contracting work, just make sure that they're familiar with all of these frameworks that exist so that they're not having to create something novel or something unique, but instead can leverage established, secure methodologies for the conveyance of data.
No, thank you for that. And I think we could probably continue to have this conversation for easily another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time today. But I highly encourage anyone watching. We are recording this. Please share this with your colleagues. Certainly we can get in touch with Rich and the Lieutenant Colonel and Deep. I want to thank you all very, very much for spending, the last hour with us. This has been so much good information and best practices and guidance for our audience. So on behalf of IBI, I'd like to thank you, our audience, also for tuning in. And again, we'll be sending out the recorded version of that with some supporting assets. And we highly encourage you to share that with your staff and colleagues and partners. Have a great day.